In 1983, the F-117 Nighthawk secretly entered service and changed aviation forever. After literally decades of chasing higher, faster-flying designs to improve survivability, the Nighthawk proved that the future was stealth. Today, 4 decades later, there are now stealth aircraft programs in active development for a half dozen nations or more. But despite becoming increasingly common, stealth technology and the tactics used to leverage it remain so complex and secretive that this entire field really lends itself to both dis and misinformation. So what do you say we spend some time busting the most common and pervasive myths about stealth aviation? I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. So normally, I like to have a complete article already written and edited that I use as a basic script outline for these episodes, but this week I'm on a bit of a time crunch because I'm about to hop a flight to Orlando to check out Lockheed Martin's latest and greatest fighter pilot simulator that they've dubbed Amaze for Amorphic Appearance Zero Projector Display. Now, admittedly, that's a jumble of words that didn't mean much to me either when LM initially reached out, but I soon came to learn that this Amaze simulator system incorporates Jumbotron technology to provide pilots in the simulator with a massive and very realistic high-fidelity screen to make them feel as though they are really in the fight. And I'm just gonna be honest with you guys, they had me at F-35 Simulator with a Jumbotron screen. Of course, I would accept this invitation, so this week we're gonna be a bit less scripted and a bit more informal, and I hope you can bear with me. And of course, make sure to check back next week where I'll be posting videos about my time at Lockheed Martin's Orlando facility and all the fun stuff they let me get my hands on. But now let's dive back into the topic at hand, which is common myths and misconceptions about stealth aviation that I see surface in the comments below my work time and time again. Some of these myths are so pervasive that I've even addressed them before, but they keep coming back, and that is definitely true for myth number 1. The idea that Germany's Horten brothers invented the first stealth aircraft with the Ho 229 all the way back in World War II. Now, if you followed this channel for a while, you already know that I have an entire video devoted to debunking this myth, and specifically calling out one particularly egregious documentary aired by the National Geographic Channel. And it's no surprise that this myth remains so common, as the production company that made that documentary, Myth Merchant Films, has repeatedly tried to misuse YouTube's copyright strike process to have the episode taken down. And despite the fact that my video clearly falls within the confines of fair use, they were successful in having the video taken down the first time, and the second time they were successful in having YouTube redirect any ad revenue from the video to them. So it is now up and no longer monetized, because I just don't think people should make a profit on disinformation. But propaganda peddlers notwithstanding, let's talk about the myth itself, because brothers Walter and Reimer Horten got their start with flying wing gliders prior to the outbreak of World War II, and then got their big break in 1943 when the head of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, called for a new light bomber design that could carry 1,000 kilograms of munitions, 1,000 kilometers per hour, to targets 1,000 kilometers away. That's 2,200 pounds at 620 miles per hour and 620 miles away, for those of us who don't speak metric. Now, these performance requirements were so ambitious that no one within Germany's traditional aviation design firms could produce an aircraft that could meet them. And that's where the Horten brothers stepped in. The Hortens didn't have much experience designing powered aircraft at all, but their experience building gliders led them to believe that a flying wing design could be aerodynamically efficient enough to meet these lofty requirements. And in a real stroke of luck for the Horten brothers, just 3 years prior, Germany's Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet had become the world's first serial production jet engine, allowing them to power their flying wing with jets rather than propellers as previous flying wings had been powered. And that is an important point of distinction, because many people seem to think that Jack Northrop copied the Ho-229 for his own flying wings that would later lead to the B-2 Spirit and forthcoming B-21 Raider. But in reality, Jack Northrop's N-1M flying wing had already been flying for 3 years before the Hortons even got to work on their Ho-229. Now, for all the internet hype surrounding this platform, you may be surprised to learn that the Horton brothers only ever actually managed to produce a single flying prototype that was very poorly designed. In fact, its first test flight had to end early because the pilot could barely keep it airborne even with the stick pulled all the way back. It landed so hard that it damaged the landing gear, and they finally figured out that it was because they had calculated its center of gravity using a measuring tape that was missing the first 10 centimeters. And that's your first clue that these guys were not advanced aeronautical engineers experimenting with technologies no nation would match for decades to come. They were amateur glider designers experimenting in a garage who had never even heard the word stealth. Now, that Ho-229 prototype would only make 2 more flights, but it would only make 1 more landing. The third test flight ended in a crash that killed the test pilot, and the entire program effectively ended right there. After the war was over, Allied forces captured all of the documentation and the remainders of the other prototypes that weren't completed, and they found that there was not a single mention of stealth or low observability or even radar anywhere in the program's documents. And perhaps most telling of all, as the United States recruited some 1,500 German scientists and researchers through Operation Paperclip, and the Soviet Union recruited or maybe kidnapped more than 2,500 more, the Horton brothers actively campaigned for a nation to recruit them to continue their work and couldn't find any takers because there was just so little promise in their Ho-229 design. So where did this whole stealth myth come from? Well, it came from Reimer Horton himself decades later. In the 1980s, when pop culture was going wild about America's stealth aircraft in development, Reimer Horton decided to take advantage of the hype to claim that his Ho-229 would have been a stealth aircraft as well, but not because of its flying wing design. No, instead, Horton claimed it would have been stealth because he would use charcoal mixed with sawdust in the glue between body panels to absorb radar waves, which is obviously ridiculous, but was believable enough at the time that it made headlines around the world. And then when the B-2 Spirit was unveiled and turned out to also be a flying wing, that seemed to bolster Horton's claims. But just to put one more nail in this coffin, you should know that Northrop Grumman and the Smithsonian Institute actually did analyze the Ho-229 design using the remains of the 229 V3 prototype that was never quite completed. And according to their peer-reviewed analysis, that Ho-229 prototype was less stealthy than a bare sheet of plywood. I'll read their conclusion here. The Ho-229 leading edge has the same characteristics as the plywood control sample, except that the frequency do not exactly match and have a shorter bandwidth. This indicates that the dielectric constant of the Ho-229 leading edge is higher than the plywood test sample. So, as far as stealth engineering goes, the Horton brothers were not quite as good as the guy who will cut sheets of plywood to size for you at Home Depot. Alright, from there, let's go to another historical stealth myth. This time, it's the myth that stealth was invented by a Soviet physicist and mathematician whose work had gone largely ignored by his own nation. And this time, there actually is a kernel of truth here. Soviet physicist and mathematician Pyotr Ufimtsev published his book, Method of Edge Waves and the Physical Theory of Diffraction, in 1962, and it did go largely ignored by the Soviet Union until ultimately being leveraged by Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works during the development of the F-117 Nighthawk. This much is all true. But this is only one small part of the story that's often taken out of context to make Ufimtsev's work seem more important than it really was. You see, stealth wasn't even on Ufimtsev's radar when he was writing this paper, and instead, the calculations derived from it just made designing and testing stealth aircraft cheaper, and as a result, more practical. But that's about it. 5 years before Ufimtsev published his book, Convair's Kingfish, which was a stealthy triangular competitor for the famed SR-71, was already being designed, and by the time Ufimtsev's book hit shelves, Boeing was already hard at work at their Model 853-21 Quietbird. Both of these stealth aircraft designs were being developed and matured using a sort of educated guess and check methodology, where you would incorporate a new design element you believed would better deflect radar waves, and then just test it in front of a radar array, make another change, and test it again. Now, just shy of a decade after being published, Ufimtsev's book found its way into the hands of the US Air Force's Foreign Technology Division. So they published an English translation that made its way to Lockheed's Skunk Works and ultimately engineer Dennis Overholser. Now, Overholser himself described Ufimtsev's work as, quote, so obtuse and impenetrable that only a nerd's nerd would have waded through it. But he did recognize that a creative interpretation of the formulas in the book could help you calculate how electromagnetic energy would reflect off of two-dimensional shapes. He then reasoned that if you could break down an aircraft design into a whole collection of these two-dimensional triangular shapes, it would be possible to calculate its radar return without having to actually build it and stick it in front of a radar array for testing. Now, this would dramatically reduce the cost and time associated with fielding new stealth aircraft, but it certainly didn't invent stealth. In fact, Ufimtsev's work was really just one piece of a larger puzzle, because in order to accurately calculate radar cross-sections, Overholser and his colleague mathematician Bill Schroeder also had to turn to the work of 19th century Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell, which, it's worth noting, was the work that Ufimtsev based his own formulas on. They also turned to the radar reflectivity studies of German engineer Arnold Johannes Sommerfeld. In other words, just like practically all scientific or engineering breakthroughs, there's no one person that we can credit for stealth or even something as simple as calculating radar cross-sections. These sorts of advancements always build upon the collective work of countless individuals across countless nations, and stealth is no different. Alright, with that myth out of the way, let's move to a more contemporary one. And that's the idea that the hard part about fielding a stealth aircraft is creating a good stealth design. Now, there's no debating that a radar deflecting design is absolutely vital to the performance of a stealth aircraft, but there are shortcuts nations can take to fielding an effective stealth design. You may have already noticed how many new stealth fighters in development bear a striking resemblance to America's F-22 Raptor. That's because its overall stealth design is really just a stealth shape, and shapes are fairly easy to copy. Now, material science plays a vital role in the performance of stealth aircraft as well, especially when it comes to radar-absorbent materials. But even if a nation unlocks the secret to effective RAM, as it's commonly known, there's still a huge hurdle they need to overcome before they can start fielding a fleet of stealth fighters or bombers. And that hurdle is production tolerances. Because even the smallest gap or seam between body panels can compromise an aircraft's stealth profile, these platforms have to be assembled with extremely precise production tolerances. Now, automating this process requires highly specialized equipment that is often exceedingly difficult and expensive to design, build, and field. And as a result, nations may be able to design stealth aircraft and even build a small number of them, but then they struggle to produce the platform in any real numbers due to this one significant production limitation. Russia's Su-57 is a good example of this challenge. Despite the Su-57's contract being awarded more than 21 years ago, to date, Russia has only managed to produce fewer than 10 serial production Su-57s. The real number is likely around 7. And as you can see by comparing Su-57 production versus the multiple F-35 production lines, this inability to automate assembly with precise tolerances can have a massive effect on production capacity and timelines. In other words, having an actual fleet of stealth fighters or bombers is not just about the technology found in the aircraft, it is also very much about the technology found in the factories producing them. Alright, let's close out with one more myth, even though there are lots more we could cover. This last one is the myth that China's J-20 and Russia's Su-57 aren't actually stealthy enough to be considered real fifth-generation fighters. Now, it's widely understood that America's F-35 and F-22 are not just significantly stealthier than China's J-20 or Russia's Su-57, but they are exponentially stealthier. In fact, they're likely thousands of times smaller on enemy radar screens than the Su-57, as one example. And as a result, you'll find plenty of folks online claiming that neither the Russian nor the Chinese fifth-generation entries are actually fifth-generation fighters at all. But the truth is, generational designations are all just sort of made up, and as a result, they don't really have universally recognized definitions or requirements that would omit either the Su-57 or the J-20 from the classification. You see, the whole idea of fighter generational designations didn't even exist prior to 1990, and even then, they weren't invented by Air Force officials or industry insiders, but rather a historian named Richard Hellion. Now, Hellion's proposal included 6 generations already by 1990, but before long, popular discourse had shaved that down to just 4. And then, when the US Air Force and Lockheed Martin began preparing to roll out the F-22 Raptor, they adopted this generational concept as a way to highlight what a massive capability leap the Raptor represented over older fighters like the F-15. By calling the Raptor the first of a new generation, this campaign brought the idea of fighter generations into the mainstream lexicon, where it was quickly adopted by other aviation firms and then national governments as a means to market their own new fighter designs. And because of the informal nature of these generational designations, different nations, companies, and even military branches are free to define the requirements for each generation in their own terms. Now today, the most widely accepted requirements for 5th generation fighters is a design that prioritizes stealth from the onset, rather than adding stealth elements after the fact, as well as a great deal of onboard computing power with sensor and data fusion capabilities. But it's important to note that that speaks more to design intent than actual performance, and that's the reality of fighter generational designations. Russia's Su-57, for instance, has widely been reported as having a radar cross-section that may potentially be about on par with an Fa-18 Super Hornet flying without external munitions or stores, and as a result, many claim that that makes it not a 5th generation fighter. But the Super Hornet is ultimately a non-stealth 4th generation fighter that has since been updated to reduce its radar return, whereas the Su-57 is a fighter design that prioritized stealth from the onset, but ultimately didn't perform very well. Their radar returns may be similar, but the intent behind their design is different, and ultimately, that really makes all the difference when it comes to fighter generations. And again, it's important to remember that we're talking about terms that have no official, formally recognized definitions or requirements. So ultimately, it's all pretty subjective, and people can just sort of call whatever they want, and make an argument to justify it. And aviation firms and entire nations have definitely taken advantage of this to market their wares. So when you see an aircraft touted as a 5th generation fighter, you should know that that really means absolutely nothing about its actual performance and only speaks to its design intentions. And if the aircraft ultimately does not live up to those intentions, well, there's no global referee to throw a flag on the play. They can still just call it whatever they want. Ultimately, branding your aircraft as a 5th generation fighter isn't that dissimilar from branding produce as organic or a new watch as military grade. People think organic means more nutritious and pesticide-free, when the US EPA themselves tell you that organically grown food can use biological pesticides as long as they're not synthetic in nature, and there's no scientific evidence that organic food is any better for you at all. People think military grade means extra tough, when anyone who's spent time in uniform can tell you it really means meeting the minimum requirements for the lowest bid. And people think 5th generation fighters need to be as stealthy as the F-22, when in reality they may not even be as stealthy as an Fa-18 Super Hornet. All of these are just marketing terms that can sometimes mean exactly what you think they do, but that can also be leveraged by bad actors to drive sales or shape perceptions, preying on people's ignorance to advance their own aims. It's no different in the produce aisle of your grocery store than it is on the production line at Sequoia. And now that I've got all the Whole Foods shoppers real mad at me, I'll call it a day. And that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandbox News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the Force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandbox News.